That sounds really confusing. Don't let your children be people that other people don't want to be around. Why? Because that makes their life harder. Okay? But if you live according to the Bible, it leads to life. Well, how am I going to do that? Well, sometimes that includes being criticized. Next, Proverbs 15 and verse number 31 and 32. It gives intelligence. Proverbs 15, 31 and 32. Let's read those together. The ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. Whoever ignores instruction despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains intelligence. Many of you know that I was educated at Memphis School of Preaching. Now, the Memphis School of Preaching is unique in one way, and that is when you give a chapel speech. I don't know if Josh has ever talked about this, but when you give a chapel speech in front of the whole school, there is teachers sitting on the front row with clipboards. And every word that you say, they mark it down. And I am a country bumpkin, and I say things, my accent used to be a lot worse, and they would mark it down. If I said 13, there's no two T's. 13, it's 13. 13, and they would mark it down. And after you get done speaking, they would stand up behind the pulpit and they would say, Brother Hackney, you need to go to school for English. Here's where you messed up, blah, 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 blah. And that hurts, especially as a new student who has never done public speaking before. But when you get to the end of your tenure there, you are a much more refined public speaker. It gives you for most people, it gives you a sort of comfort when you are behind a podium talking to a group of people because you've been criticized. And then you find yourself start to criticizing yourself and becoming better on your own. In the same way, if we take criticism the right way, if it's criticism that comes from love, it will lead us to life and it will give us intelligence. It will make us a stronger person. Okay, we can all look back on mistakes that we've made in our past and say, I'm going to learn from it. I'm going to grow from it. I'm going to get better. I'm going to try to move forward positively because of this. Now, that being said, we all still will make mistakes. And you all know I've been here for, I think, 7 years. You all know I've made plenty of mistakes while preaching and teaching. I wanted to share this funny story with you that happened a few years ago. It did not happen here, but it was one that kind of caught me off guard. At the congregation where I had formerly worked, I had preached a lesson on a typical Sunday morning, didn't think much of it. I'm standing in the back, shaking hands, talking to people, and a guy comes up to me, and he was a joking kind of guy. He always joked around. And he said, hey man, what happened to you this morning? And I just was like, I don't know, what do you mean? And he goes, I've been a Christian for 65 years, and that was the worst lesson I've ever heard. And I just I thought he was joking. I was like, oh, well, yeah, whatever. And smile goes away. I'm serious. He grabbed me by the shoulder. He said, I tapped my wife on the shoulder 3 times to tell her how bad your sermon was while you were preaching. And I was just like, oh, man, well, I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to preach again. And then he just hugged me and goes, I tell you that because I love you. I was like, okay, whew, okay, all right. We all make mistakes, but how do you bounce back? How do you respond? You take those criticisms, you got to throw out the bad. Sometimes there's a lot of bad. You got to throw out the bad, and you got to build a better you moving forward. Okay, remember, not all criticism comes from a place of jealousy and hatred and malicious intent. A lot of criticism, though it may be worded in the wrong way, it comes from love. It's meant to give you life. It's meant to help you build and gain intelligence and become a better version of yourself, whether that be a Christian in the spiritual sense, or maybe even just a better student at school or a better employee at work. We might be criticized by our bosses. It's not the end of the world. We live in a very reactionary society, especially my age group. Hey, I'm putting myself out there first. My age group, if you criticize us, we shell up, we're done. It's the end of everything if you criticize us once, a lot of times. But we've got to learn as children of God how to bounce back from negative criticism and how to accept good criticism. All right, the last point on looking at positive criticism comes from love, it leads to life, it gives intelligence. It's also a blessing. It is a blessing. Look at Proverbs chapter 25. And let's go down to verse number 12. Proverb 25. And let's look at verse number 12. Like a gold ring or ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. I love how he uses precious objects in the same context of being criticized and not only accepting it, that listening ear, but also the one who gives it. You know what I hear when I hear criticism, if it comes from love? Somebody willing to upset me to make me better. You know, a lot of people don't care enough about you to criticize. And now we're not talking about online. I'm sure if you post something online, you can get criticism very quickly from people you don't know. I'm talking about somebody that's willing to sit down with you or give you a phone call and say, hey, I think we might need to work on this. That takes a lot of boldness. That takes a lot of love to do that. Because most people would talk about you behind your back and not to your face, right? But if you have somebody willing to sit down with you and say, hey, maybe we should reconsider this, that means that you're loved. That means that somebody was willing to have a very uncomfortable conversation with you. That's a hard thing to find. And so when we see criticism, remember, not everything someone says, despite the tone, not everything that someone says that seems negative is negative. A lot of times it points back to these points. It's loving, it's meant to enrich your life, it's meant to give you intelligence, and at the end of the day, it's precious, it's a blessing. That means somebody cared enough about you to have a conversation that they didn't want to have. We find that in the New Testament, which is an example we'll go on to in a minute, but that's exactly what Paul did to Peter. I'm sure that conversation was not fun for either of them in Galatians chapter 2, but they had it anyway because Paul loved Peter. And that's what we ought to have with one another. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, feel free. But we're going to move on to that next point there. How do the unwise view criticism? Let's go to Proverbs chapter 9 for this point. How do the unwise view criticism? Okay, if you go to chapter 9, verses 7 through 9, you'll see that many times the unwise immediately react and view any type of criticism as a personal attack. Okay, if you don't like the outfit that I'm wearing, if you don't like the haircut I have, that means you don't like me. You must not like me. Okay, I deal with it with teenagers, right? If you don't like a teenager's boyfriend or girlfriend, what do? They say, well, you don't like me. No, I don't really care for that boy or that girl. Well, you're not seeing me. And a lot of times they get really, really emotional about things like that, okay? I do it over football. If you criticize my football team, you're dead to me. You're just dead to me. You're over with. No, I'm just kidding. But a lot of times we can get very reactionary. So let's look at how the unwise accept criticism or react to, rather, criticism, verses 7 through 9. Whoever corrects a scoffer, okay, gets himself abuse. He who reproves a wicked man incurs injury. Do not reprove a scoffer, or he will hate you. Reprove a wise man, and he will love you. Give instruction to a wise man, and he will be still wiser. So you have two very different men painted in chapter 9, 7 through 9. The unwise immediately look at where they put the attention. They don't attack the criticism. Who do they attack? The criticizer. They attack the messenger. You can tell the scoffer in this case, or the unwise, something clear in their life that needs to change, that a lot of times they know needs to change. And you could say, hey brother, hey sister, here's where you're wrong. Here's where the Bible is right, and here's where you are wrong. And what are they going to do? They're going to turn it back on you. That is the characteristic of someone who is unwise, called a scoffer. Okay, you know, I think about this a lot, especially when we do personal Bible studies with people. If you really get somebody to the point of the, bare knuckle truth, and you're sitting across a table with somebody and you say, all right, here's the plan of salvation. And you can read the words. You can read what Jesus said to Nicodemus in John chapter 3. You can read 1 Peter 3:21, whereas baptism also does now save us. You can read about Acts and all the examples in Acts, whether it be Acts 2 or Acts chapter 8. You can go to Romans chapter 6 and you can talk to them and you get them to the point of baptism. And that's where the contention comes into a lot of Bible studies, because the denominational world does not always agree on baptism. And you get them to that point and you say, all right, we've been on the same page till this point. Now we get to this pinnacle. And a lot of times, instead of facing the truth and saying, then they'll go to, I've known a lot of people in the Church of Christ and they're hypocrites. Where did that come from? And I'm not saying that there's not hypocrites, okay? That's not the point. But they've turned the criticism that they know that they have a problem with into a personal thing. And hey, you might be right about that verse, but I'm going to ignore that. I'm going to step around that, and I'm going to go straight to a personal attack. Well, maybe, are you trying to tell me that my mom is going to hell? And they'll try to make it very, very personal, and they'll try to take you away from the exact thing that we were trying to address. Okay, the scoffer, the unwise, is someone who views every single criticism as a personal attack. Not everything everyone says is a personal attack. Again, we've got to learn to roll with some punches. We're going to have them. I mean, surely, this is an adult class, surely every adult in here knows that. But, as a congregation and as a church as a whole, we've got to learn to deal with these a little better. But, don't be the scoffer in this case, but be the wise. If there's something in my life that's wrong, if there's something in my life that needs to change and it's brought up, don't view it as a personal attack. Try to grow from it. In 1 Corinthians chapter 5, we have a man that was with his father's wife, so his stepmother, more than likely in that case. And Paul says that when you were supposed to be mourning over this sin, what were they? They were puffed up. They were proud. If you walked into the congregation in Corinth and said, that man is living in open sin, they didn't view the criticism anything other than a personal attack. And they rallied around this sinner and gave him a shelter, which we'll discuss that in just a little bit. Not that exact case, but there's a verse that speaks to that. But in the first place, how does the unwise deal with criticism? They view it as a personal attack, almost every time. All right, Proverb 13 in verse number 1. A lot of times they'll just ignore criticism, just not address it at all. A wise son hears his father's instruction, but a scoffer does not listen to rebuke. They simply will not listen to it, my way or the highway. Hey, I'm just not even going to address it. Again, going back to that idea of a personal Bible study, I want to point out that when we stand on the ground of biblical truths, it's not a criticism. It really isn't. At the very base of what we're talking about, it's not a criticism. Okay, if we brought it into a different context, it might make a little bit more sense. Does everybody remember the signs, the billboards, the commercials that said click it or ticket, right? All over, click it or ticket. If you don't buckle up, you're going to get a ticket. If I'm riding with my friend in the car and we pass one of those billboards and I say, hey, bud, you're not wearing your seatbelt. If you don't click it, you're going to get a ticket. Would they view that as a personal attack? No. Would they view that as a criticism? No. It is a suggestion based on the law. When we stand behind biblical truths, we have to understand no matter how people take it, people might try to bring us into that boxing ring of personal attacks and, well, you are this and your church is this. When people try to take it there and get personal with it, remember it's the same scenario. All I'm doing is highlighting the truth in this word. This is not my anything. This is God's word. And I'm standing on the biblical truth. Now, you can take it as a criticism, and I'm going to do my best in my Christian, way to try to relay it in a loving way where you don't take it as a personal attack and a criticism. But from the Bible studier's perspective, the one conducting the Bible study, you have to understand that it's not a personal thing. It is the same scenario of click it or ticket. If you don't wear your seatbelt, you're going to get a ticket. If you don't obey God, you're not going to enjoy heaven with God. That's all we're saying. And we're showing people how to do it. So don't let people take it personally, but if they want to take it personally, you have to have the understanding that this is not a personal thing. This is me reminding you of the law of God. This is not my law, this is God's law. And anybody who is not humble in the sight of God's law is not going to be there. That's as simple as it is. Proverbs 15 and verse number 12. They will avoid people who will criticize them. They will avoid people who will criticize them. Proverb 15 and verse number 12. The scoffer does not like to be reproved. I guess I'm a scoffer. It's very hard to say that we love criticism. But he gives a little bit more context to this. Not only does he not like to be reproved, but look at the lengths he goes. He will not go to the wise. He avoids the wise. Okay, if you know that there's somebody over here that is going to criticize my behavior, I'm not going to spend time with that person. We've seen that before. Friends, I'm going to be plain as day. How many times have we had somebody sitting in a congregation, whether it was here or somebody else, who is starting to fall away, and what do? We try to call them, we try to reach out to them. Do we get a response all the time? A lot of times we don't. And why? Because they know that if we talk to them, if somebody from church talks to them, they might try to talk me out of this bad behavior. So I'm going to do my best to avoid this person because I know we're going to have that conversation. And that's an ugly truth, but that is a truth. And that is a characteristic of the unwise. Somebody who sees the wise man sitting over here, he says, I don't want to be reproved, I don't want you to criticize me, so I'm not going to the wise. We need to be known as people who seek after wisdom. We need to be known as people who go talk to those who have been Christians longer than us, that have more spiritual, war under their belt, if you will, who have been there and done that. And that's who we need to talk to. But a lot of times when we're acting poorly, that's not what we do. We run from the criticism, not towards it, not towards the counsel, because we view everything as criticism. Any questions, comments, interjections, rebuttals? Okay, all right, let's go to the next one. Proverb 29 and verse number 1. A lot of times we see this. People that double down on their own behavior or way of life. And boy, have we seen this in Scripture many, many times. Proverb 29 and verse number 1. He who is often reproved, okay, so this person hears the reproof, but what is his reaction? Yet stiffens his neck, will suddenly be broken beyond healing. Have you ever had that conversation with somebody that just can't listen? They can hear your words, but they can't listen. That is the characteristic of, Jeremiah. Just think, not Jeremiah, but the people in Jeremiah's day. You think about those people for a minute. In Jeremiah chapter 6 and verse number 15, it says, were the people ashamed when they committed abomination? No, they were not shamed. They could not blush. They had lost the ability to blush. They had become hardened in their shell of self-absorption and self-pleasure and self-serving that they could not even be reasoned with. When you tried to bring up something that was glaringly wrong in their life and say, hey, you can't live that way, they were unaffected by it at all. They weren't affected by it at all. They couldn't even blush. And how many times in Scripture do we have somebody who knows that there's something that needs to change, and they buckle down, they double down, and they don't change? That's the whole story that we start the Bible with in Exodus. Right? Pharaoh. You really think about it. I've given a lesson on it before. But when Pharaoh was approached about the frogs, remember that? There's all these frogs everywhere. They're on the beds, in the pots. They're all over the land. And Moses approaches Pharaoh and says, when do you want me to take these frogs away? And he says, tomorrow. If that's not the most ignorant, statement you've ever read, I don't know what is. Tomorrow. Handle it tomorrow. I want to sleep with these frogs one more night jumping on my face while I'm trying to sleep. That's how much sense it makes. Why didn't he say now? Why? Because he was proud. He had pride. And some people's pride is so strong that they know they need to change. They're not going to do it. They're going to dig those heels in. They're going to double down, and they're going to sit there in their own self-righteousness. They're never going to change. That is a characteristic of the unwise. The wise person, again, going back to our last points, they know criticism comes from love a lot of times. Okay, again, we're not talking about how people word it. We're talking about the contents of the conversation. Criticism comes from love. It's meant to be life-giving. It's meant to give you intelligence. It's meant to build you up and make you a better person. The unwise, knee-jerk reaction. Everything that you say negative about me is a personal attack. It's not that you don't like my behavior. It's that you don't like me, and I have a problem with that. Number two, I'll just ignore what you have to say. I'll listen to you, but I'm going to just ignore it. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just going to keep on rolling down the road. Number three, if you have something bad to say about me, I just won't talk to you. I will avoid you at all costs. And then finally, you catch me, I hear you, I'm just going to double down. I am right. I'll never submit to what the Bible says. I will never, every hill is worth dying on to some people. You know that phrase, not every hill is worth dying on. Some people, every hill is worth dying on. That's not necessarily the nature we should have as Christians. Any comments before we move on to the next point? Yes, ma'am. Mm-hmm. Jeremiah 6:15. That's a great verse. Yep. Yeah, that has been a verse. That's been one of my favorite verses for years, because is there a better verse that could describe people today? I mean, really, it's a great verse, but see, that's another point. Let's talk about that for a minute. Whatever we're going through culturally as a congregation, as people of God, people have done this before. Jeremiah did this a long time ago. Jeremiah said, Jeremiah 20 and verse number 9, I said, I will not speak anymore or mention the Lord. I don't want to have anything to do with it. But his word was like a fire shut up in my bones, and I was weary with forbearing, and I could not stand. I had to preach it. I didn't want to preach it. Do you think Jeremiah wanted to preach to those people? I mean, he's known as the lamenting prophet. Jeremiah had one friend throughout the entire book of Jeremiah. It was King Baruch. And in chapter 45, he had to rebuke his own only friend, essentially, and go preach to those people. Ezekiel was told that you're going to go preach to the people, and the people are going to ignore you. They're not going to listen to you, but go preach to them anyway. And gave this whole spiel in chapter 3 of Ezekiel about how you are a watchman. You got to get out there and you got to teach. No matter what, if they listen or not, you got to go out there and teach. So all of the prophets dealt with people not only like our culture, but even worse. To the point where, again, Jeremiah 6:15, they could not blush. They could not care any less. I mean, if you go to 1 Corinthians 1, starting in verse number 18 through the rest of the chapter. Romans chapter 1, starting in verse number 18 through the rest of the chapter. That is the entire state of the Romans. God gave them up. God gave them up. How many times does it say that in that text? God showed them himself. They were without excuse, because what can be known about God is seen through nature. But they served the creature rather than the creator. So God gave them up. So all throughout history, from the beginning of the Bible to the very end, there's been people that are like our culture, proud of sin, losing the ability to blush, but even worse than our culture. So whatever we're going through, go to the prophets. Take strength from the prophets, because they can give you so much wisdom about how to deal with people that are just unrighteous. Okay? And Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, is one of the best ones. But thank you for bringing that up. Anything else on that point? Yes, sir.
You might touch on this later, but Paul in Galatians 4:16, do you hate me because I teach?
Yeah, that's a great text. Paul in Galatians 4:16. We just recently went over. We are going to go to Galatians chapter 2 in just a minute. But we went over Galatians with the kids not long ago. And one of my favorite things when he's talking to the Galatians, he says there was a time where you would have, and it sounds graphic, but he's trying to relay a point. There was a time when you would have gouged your eyes out for me. You would have done anything for me. And I am in the pains of childbirth over you. He felt so strongly about the congregations meeting in the region of Galatia that he was physically tore up over it. But because of truth and the rejection of the criticisms that truth brings, he had now become their enemy. Great point. Anything else? All right, let's go to some examples of how the wise view... we're not to the examples yet. Sorry about that. How the wise view criticism. All right, let's go to Proverbs chapter 12. Might mean we need to speed up here. Proverbs chapter 12. They act wisely and not rashly. Proverbs 12 and verse number 1. Whoever loves discipline loves knowledge, but he who hates reproof is, and ESV says the word stupid. Some versions might say ignorant or foolish or a scoffer or something along those lines. But if you love discipline, you love knowledge, you're doing good. But those who hate reproof, they are acting ignorantly. So you see a picture there of someone who is trying to get knowledge out of criticism. You have the reproof and someone who loves knowledge. So they act wisely, not rashly. They think about it. Now, Proverbs 15 and verse number 5, those who are wise, they build a better future for themselves. Look at Proverbs 15 and verse number 5. The reason why I use the word future is there at the end of the verse. A fool despises his father's instruction, but whoever heeds reproof is prudent. If you look up the definition, the English definition of prudent, it is a wise looking forward to the future. It is planning for your future. Okay, those who are heeding reproof, listening to criticism, biblical criticism in this case, if you are adjusting your life accordingly, you're looking forward to a better future. 15:5. 17:10. They consider the criticism. Again, it doesn't just roll off you like water off a duck's back, but you instead sit down and think about how you could make yourself better. A rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding. This is a beautiful verse. Rebuke goes deeper into a man of understanding than 100 blows into a fool. Okay, if you say something, even it might be a small criticism, but if you say a well thought out, valid, legitimate criticism to someone who is wise, that will affect them. Meanwhile, you can scream to the top of your lungs at those who are foolish. They don't care. They're not going to hear a word you say. But you whisper one little thing to someone who loves understanding, who is wise, they're going to hear it. That criticism, that reproof, that rebuke will go deeper into a wise man. Number next, 27 and verse number 5 and 6. They consider the motivation of the critic. That's also something that we need to get in the habit of, the motivation of the critic. How did we start this discussion? Sometimes criticism comes from love. Okay, so we need to consider the motivation of the critic. So let's go back to verse 5 and 6 of chapter 27. Better is open rebuke than hidden love. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. Profuse are the kisses of an enemy. One thing I love is in verse 6. Even though the person is wounding them, they still acknowledge that this is a friend. They understand who's the real enemy. Meanwhile, the enemy's over there kissing them, but you know who the enemy is. So in the midst of getting reproof, or getting, as the text says here, rebuke in verse 5, in the midst of being rebuked, they did not lose sight of who had their best interest in mind. They knew who their friends were and who their enemies were, even though their actions at the time seemed, counterproductive, counterintuitive. All right, anything else on this point? All right, let's go to examples of constructive criticism. And we only have 3 examples, so we can take as much time as we have left on these points. Let's go back to 2 Samuel chapter 12. 2 Samuel chapter 12. And this is, again, my heart goes out to not only the king, in this case, who had sin in his life that needed to be repented of, but my heart goes out to Nathan. As we go through this text, I want you to think about how difficult it would be to be Nathan, talking to King David. So let's start there in verse number 1, and we'll drop down. I'll put down verse 7, but we might read a little bit further. Okay, this is after David sins with Bathsheba. You guys remember that Uriah had Bathsheba. David had all of these women that he had access to. He went after Uriah's wife. He sent Uriah to the front lines. He had Uriah killed. One thing leads to another. There's lies, there's deception, there's murder. All of these things are tied up in David's sin with Bathsheba. So here comes Nathan. And God says to Nathan, I need you to go tell a story to David. Now, this is not an easy position to be in. Here's what he has to do. Verse number 1, the Lord sent Nathan to David. He came to him and said, Now there were 2 men in a certain city. One was rich and the other was poor. The rich man had many flocks and herds, but the poor man had nothing save 1 ewe lamb. I heard a preacher one time, he was probably joking, but he called it 1 ewe lamb. It was not an ewe lamb, it's a ewe lamb, which he had bought. And when he had brought it up, it grew up with him and with his children. This is the family pet. Okay? It grew up with him and his children. It used to eat of his morsel and drink of his cup and lie in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now, verse 4, there came a traveler to the rich man, the neighbor who had everything. He was unwilling to take of his own flock or herd to prepare for the guest who had come to him, but he took the poor man's lamb. He killed it, obviously. He prepared it for the man who had come to him. David's response is telling. David's anger was greatly kindled against the man, and he said to Nathan, As the Lord lives, the man who has done this deserves to die. Okay, that's what he starts off with. The man deserves to die. He shall restore the lamb 4-fold because he did this thing and because he had no pity. And one of the hardest verses to have to say is verse number 7. Nathan said to David, You are the man. Again, David is already angry about this story. When you get stuck with a really harsh statement like that, you are the man, what if David just decides to have Nathan killed? What if David just blows up on the whole situation? He very well could have. That's not what happened. But thanks be to Nathan, who is willing to have that discussion with that king and sit down with him and say, hey, maybe you didn't realize it, but when I put it into a story context, story format, now you realize how egregious your sin is. And David again repents. So thanks be to Nathan who had that difficult discussion. Next, 2 Kings chapter 5. 2 Kings chapter 5, and I find this one rather interesting as well. You know this story very well. This is the story of Naaman. Naaman was a very powerful man, but he also was a leper. We're going to start there in verses 10 through 14. If you back up, it talks about how Naaman had servants. He had servants, and these servants have this discussion with Naaman. One of them is from Israel. She says, I know of a prophet. He can heal you of your leprosy. And that's how this story gets started. In verse number 3, the servant girl says, Would that my Lord were here, the prophet, who is in Samaria, he would cure him of his leprosy. So Naaman went in and told his Lord, thus and so spoke the girl from the land of Israel. So the king of Syria said, go now, I'll send a letter to the king of Israel. So through the exchange of information, they get this letter to the prophet. Now, verse number 10 is where we're going to pick up. Elisha sent a messenger saying, go wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh shall be restored, and you shall be clean. But Naaman was angry. He went away, saying, behold, I thought that he would surely come out to me, stand and call upon the name of the Lord, his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. Let's pause right there. Verse number 11 is a great verse to quote. Because if you look at the first part of that verse, behold, I thought, that is the opening statement to a lot of error. A lot of false doctrine and a lot of misconception comes from behold, I thought. Well, he told me to go do this, but I thought it was going to be this way. And so he's angry about this. In verse number 12, he says, are not Abna and Pharpar, the rivers of Damascus, better than the waters of Israel? Could I not go wash in them and be clean? So he turned and went away in rage. But again, the servant, verse number 13, came near and said to him, my father is it is a great word from the prophet that has spoken to you. Will you not do it? Has he actually said to you, go wash and be cleaned? Okay, so the end of verse 13 is right there, but you could also add the word duh at the end of verse 13. She goes, if he told you to do it, just go do it. What are you complaining about? He gave you a solution. So verse 14, he says, when he went down, he dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan according to the word of the man of God. His flesh was restored. If it hadn't been for the servant having that criticizing moment, going to her superior and saying, hey, I think you're kind of blowing this out of proportion. Maybe you should listen to him. If it wasn't for that rationality, Naaman would have died a leper. But he didn't because of constructive criticism. Galatians chapter 2 is where we're going to pull it all to a close here. And we've already considered verbally chapter 4, but we're going to go back to chapter 2 of Galatians, pick up verses 11 through 14, and we'll make this quick. Paul opposes Peter. Okay, Paul writing says, when Cephas came, that's Peter, came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. For before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they, that being the Jewish party, came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision party. Keep in mind, Acts chapter 10, who was the first person that is supposed to deliver the gospel to the Gentiles? Peter. And here he is, when the Jews walk in, he will not eat with the Gentiles. So, verse 13, and the rest of the Jews acted hypocritically along with him, so that even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. But when I saw that their conduct was not in step with the truth of the gospel, I said to Cephas and before them all, if you, though a Jew, live like a Gentile and not like a Jew, how can you force Gentiles to live like Jews? Sometimes criticism is not fun, but sometimes it needs to be said. We need to speak with boldness, speak with love, and when the tables are turned and we are accepting criticism, understand that criticism is meant to build you up. We got to throw out the bad criticism. Sometimes it's not even criticism. Sometimes it's just hateful speech. We got to learn how to decipher what's what and become better and stronger Christians. Thank you so much for your time.